I think we should probably get underway at this point. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars in Oxford. And it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this afternoon's discussion, which is jointly sponsored by Las Casas and St Mary's University, Twickenham. Thank you to our speakers and all of you for joining us for this reflection on what Fratelli Tutti means for us. And without further ado, I hand over to the Rev Dr Ashley Beck, who teaches at St Mary's and is president of the Catholic Theological Association of Great Britain. Ashley.
Thank you very much, Richard. And it's a great honour for St Mary's and the Pastoral Review to be working with Las Casas for this symposium today. And as you know, there's a later session this afternoon as well. I've been asked just to say a couple of words about social teaching before I introduce our first speaker. Catholic social teaching is the branch of moral theology which I suppose relates most clearly to the work of this encyclical. But in it I found what is a very good and fresh definition really in the early part of Pope Francis' letter. Talking about St. Francis, he says, the Pope says, Francis felt himself a brother to the sun, the sea and the wind. Yet he knew that he was even closer to those of his own flesh. Wherever he went, he sowed seeds of peace and walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the infirm, and the outcast, the least of his brothers and sisters. In a way, that's really what social teaching is all about, and it's what this letter's about. And it's very good to be able to welcome all of you this afternoon for this webinar. And I begin by introducing our first panelist this afternoon. Professor Anna Sapir Abulafia is professor of the study of the Abrahamic religions in the Theology and Religion faculty at Oxford after she's been teaching many years in Cambridge. The main focus of her research has been the interaction between medieval Christianity and Judaism within the broad context of the 12th and 13th century developments in theology and the Church. Her current research concerns medieval canon law through the lens of Christian-Jewish relations. It's a great privilege to have you with us, Anna, and I now hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I should start with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on contemporary interfaith matters. The remarks I'm about to make are my reflections of Fratelli Tutti as the professor of the study of the Abrahamic religions and as an active member of the Jewish community. My academic expertise, as you've just heard, is interactions between medieval Christianity and Judaism in the Latin West. Let me begin by saying that I find it heartening that Fratelli Tutti approaches Judaism with respect in the sections concerning social justice. To give an example, it references the maxim of Hillel, the renowned Jewish sage who died in Jerusalem in the year 10 of the Common Era. Hillel, his maxim, Hillel said, "Do not do unto others what you would not want them to do to you." That is the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. In the following discussion, the New Testament is described as strengthening this maxim, not superseding it. Jewish traditions concerning the care of foreigners is given space. And again, New Testament texts are seen as a continuation of this ethos, not its replacement. The parable of the Good Samaritan is used sensitively in a way that, to my mind, does not have anti-Jewish undertones, which could easily have been the case. In short, the lack of supersessionist language and sentiments is refreshing. This is in line with the attempts made in the Gifts and Calling of God Are Irrevocable discussion document of 1015 to lay supersessionism to rest. As you will know, the Gifts and Calling document celebrated the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. It is also significant to note that the Shoah is properly mentioned in Fratelli Tutti. This was also the case in the Gifts and Calling paper. This is important because mention of the Holocaust did not make it into the text of Nostra Aetate, however groundbreaking it was in many other respects. Another reason this is significant is because Holocaust denial or denial of the significance of the Holocaust are elements of new forms of contemporary anti-Semitism. It also seems to me welcome that Fratelli Tutti is reaching out to Muslims as equal partners. This is heartening. This is a heartening sign of better relations between the Vatican and leaders of Sunni Islam after the strained relations under Pope Benedict XVI. It is also a welcome improvement over the situation surrounding the publication of the Gifts and Calling document. That document did not include reflections on Muslims, even though Islam had been included as an Abrahamic faith in Nostra Aetate. And whereas the Gifts and Calling document stated, and I quote, that the Catholic Church neither conducts nor supports any specific institutional mission work directed towards Jews, end of quote, in the aftermath of the publication of the Gifts and Calling document, Cardinal Koch, the spokesman on interreligious affairs in the Vatican, was reported as declaring that this exception did not apply to Muslims. Fratelli Tutti's rapprochement to Muslims is done through the specific mention of the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Professor Ahmad Al-Tayeb, whom the Pope met in Abu Dhabi in February 2019, and with whom he published a document on human fraternity for world peace and living. Al-Tayeb has been a professor of philosophy at Al-Azhar for many decades. Since 2010, he has been the university's Grand Imam. The university is the focal point for the study of jurisprudence in Sunni Islam. The ethos of the joint document signed by the Pope and the Grand Imam has fed into Fratelli Tutti and produces heartwarming statements on the role of religion in society and the prospects of fruitful interreligious relations. In Fratelli Tutti, the Pope says, quote, in my fraternal meeting with the Grand Imam, Ahmad al-Tayeb, we resolutely declared that religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility, and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. These tragic realities are the consequence of a deviation from religious teachings. They result from a political manipulation of religions and from interpretations made by religious groups who, in the course of history, have taken advantage of the power of religious sentiment in the hearts of men and women. God the Almighty has no need to be defended by anyone and does not want his name to be used to terrorize people, end of quote. In his joint document with the Grand Imam, Pope Francis had stated, quote, freedom is the right of every person. Each individual enjoys the freedom of belief, thought, expression, and action. The pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in his wisdom, through which he created human beings. This divine wisdom is the source from which the right to freedom of belief and the freedom to be different derives, unquote. One can only hope that these noble sentiments can be voiced, heard, and put into practice as powerfully within both parties' communities as they are when speaking to each other. Religious freedom is a crucially important topic in Fratelli Tutti. Pope Francis asserts, quote, one fundamental human right must not be forgotten in the journey towards fraternity and peace. It is religious freedom for believers of all religions. That freedom proclaims that we can build harmony and understanding between different cultures and religions. It also testifies to the fact that since the important things we share are so many, it is possible to find a means of serene, ordered, and peaceful coexistence, accepting our differences and rejoicing that as the children of the one God, we are all brothers and sisters," unquote. The Pope is repeating words he spoke in Bethlehem in May 2014. Echoing the sentiments expressed in Nostra Aetate, Francis also states, quote, "The Church esteems the ways in which God works in other religions and rejects nothing of what is true and holy in these religions. She has a high regard for their manner of life and conduct, their precepts and doctrines, which often reflect a ray of that truth which enlightens all men and women," end of quote. The assertion that all religions have value in and of themselves is a very important aspect of interfaith dialogue. But in Fratelli Tutti, the Pope seems to be more concerned with calling on all faith traditions to combat the freedom he despises, and that is the freedom of market forces which ignore the exigencies of the common good. He decries a global economy which disregards the needs of local communities and overrides local diversities to impose cultural homogeneity. In his view, this artificial unity does nothing more than divide people and countries, or as he puts it in the words of Benedict XVI, "As society becomes ever more globalized, it makes us neighbors, but does not make us brothers." According to Fratelli Tutti, pandering to this kind of false freedom promotes unfettered individualism, which seeks material gains without any considerations of the common good. The important role religions have to play in society is to provide the necessary counterweight to these global trends in which rampant individualism make idols out of material gain, which trample on the needs of the poor and unprotected members of society. According to this way of thinking, religious recognition of the Almighty leads to the recognition of the needs of fellow human beings. Religions need to work together to promote the social program to help the poor and dispossessed, as laid out in Fratelli Tutti. In my reading of it, Fratelli Tutti is much more interested in what religions can do together to combat destructive individualism and the rampant wastefulness which is destroying the planet than in specific dialogue between Roman Catholicism and other religions. Pope Francis deals with that topic in other documents, but this does not seem to be his priority in Fratelli Tutti. In Fratelli Tutti, it is about religions together standing up to the ills of secular society. And the clarion call to this combined effort is the COVID-19 crisis. For the pandemic has made everyone realize just how ephemeral material gain is and how dependent human beings are of each other. And this brings me to the question of our panel discussion. How does all of this resonate in British society today? Let's start with the pandemic. Yes, I think the notion that COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for many in Britain, that human beings are not as much in control of their destiny as they might have thought. And from my own experience in my synagogue, I know that we have never had so many people regularly attend Sabbath service as we do now via Zoom. Not only do far more people attend, they attend for the whole service, and astonishingly, for a Jewish service, they come on time. Added to that, we have had an increase of interest for our services from new people, Jews and non-Jews. From my conversations with my students and colleagues, I know that the reconfiguration of services using online platforms is a shared concern across the religious divides. COVID-19 has also made people much more aware of the importance of families and the need for human beings to have physical contact with each other. However much we have all relied on the internet to continue working and maintaining social contact, we have been made to realize that virtual reality is but a poor substitute for the real thing. Human beings are just as gregarious as the ancient philosophers taught us. We need each other, and we need to nurture the common good. As for Fratelli Tutti's social program, the Pope's concern for social justice will certainly resonate with synagogues. In Cambridge, sorry, I actually live in the other place, my synagogue collaborates with local churches and other religious organizations to help the homeless. This is true across the country. Concern for the environment is a major concern within Jewish communities. Tikkun Olam, repair of the world, is an important concept within Judaism and has been a driving force in many congregations to engage in fair trade and other projects. The promotion of dialogue between different religions centered on social concerns rather than theological issues seems very relevant for today's Britain. Clearly, this is a fruitful way of learning about each other's traditions through shared concerns in local communities. What I'm far more doubtful about is the appeal of Fratelli Tutti's simplistic take on the economy. It is not difficult to decry the social ills of unrestrained capitalism. The vast inequalities in wealth, healthcare, and education between different parts of the world are obvious. Less obvious is finding alternative economic systems which produce more just societies. The history of the 20th century has certainly taught us that. What I'm also doubtful about is how helpful it is to set up such a stark dichotomy between what the Pope calls true values of religion and the values of those with no sense of the deity. As Fratelli Tutti puts it, quote, "From our faith experience and from the wisdom accumulated over centuries, but also from lessons learned from our many weaknesses and failures, we, the believers of the different religions, know that our witness to God benefits our societies. The effort to seek God with a sincere heart, provided it is never sullied by ideological or self-serving aims, helps us recognize one another as traveling companions, truly brothers and sisters. We are convinced that when in the name of an ideology, there's an attempt to remove God from a society, that society ends up adoring idols, and very soon men and women lose their way. Their dignity is trampled and their rights violated. You know well how much suffering is caused by the denial of freedom of conscience and of religious freedom, and how that wound leaves a humanity which is impoverished because it lacks hope and ideals to guide it." End of quote. The latter part of the quotation are words which Pope Francis spoke in Albania in 2014. And yes, the atheistic Marxist-Leninist regime of Enver Hoxha and other dictators of that ilk have unleashed untold misery. But these are extremes which have little to do with many thoughtful, non-religious people who have just as much love for their fellow human beings as those coming from a religious tradition. I think this kind of hyperbole probably does more harm than good. To end on a more positive note, the thing I shall take away from Fratelli Tutti is the concept of penitential memory. The Pope uses this term to emphasize the importance of knowing the truth about the past and working towards reconciliation in a peace process. The concept is, of course, just as applicable to interfaith dialogue between Christians and Jews. But I think the concept could actually be incredibly useful in contemporary discussions on whether or not to erase the memory of people in the past who were engaged in activities now thought reprehensible by dismantling their monuments or removing their names. Penitential memory allows us to remember the past without glorifying it. It allows us to learn from the past, all the while appreciating how past wrongs still bear their imprint on us today. In short, It allows us to move forward in full acknowledgement of what has gone before. Finding a way to move forward without severing our ties with the past would seem to me just as important for the University of Oxford as for the rest of British society. Thank you.
Anna, thank you very much indeed. That was a tremendous beginning to our sessions this afternoon. There's a great deal there, which I hope we'll have the chance to come back to. It's now a great pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague, Peter Tyler, who is Professor of Pastoral Theology at St Mary's University and Director of the Inspire Research Centre on Spirituality and Society. He's one of the great experts in this country on spirituality. He's written and edited many books on it. He runs our master's programme in spirituality at St Mary's. He's also the author of significant books about, among other things, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. And he's also a practicing psychotherapist. Peter, it's great to have you with us this afternoon, and it's all over to you now.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you to everyone for this kind invitation to take part in this very important seminar. And thank you for Professor Anna for starting the ball rolling. I think it's having you here is really putting into action what the Pope is talking about. One of my American journalist friends, when I was talking to him about Fratelli Tutti, he said, yeah, Pope Francis is the Pope that keeps on giving. And, you know, we feel as though we're in a sort of interesting journey with this Pope. We're never quite sure what's going to come next. And so I wanted to sort of keep some of that effervescence that's around. I know it can get a bit tedious watching talking heads all the time on Zoom. So to sort of break it up, I've got a PowerPoint, so I hope you don't mind me sharing that with you. And then if you find what I have to say a little tedious, you can look at the nice pictures. And here's a nice picture to begin with. It's one of what I would call one of the patron saints of dialogue, Armando Lull, the Catalonian who engaged, amongst other things, in dialogue with the Jews of Spain. And I'm sure Professor Anna has come across him in her own studies. And I've called this short talk Fratelli Tutti and the mission of dialogue. And those are two words, mission and dialogue, that don't normally go together, certainly in Catholic circles. But looking back at Pope Francis's oeuvre, what he's written over the last few years, these three terms, witness and mission, go together, as well as prayer, witness and mission. So I'm sort of taking, as I think we are this afternoon, I'm taking this diamond of Fratelli Tutti and I'm just moving it round in the light, and we're going to see a few things flashing through it. And I'm just going to share that with you. The first thing to say is that this doesn't come out of nowhere. And again, I'm sure this will come out repeatedly throughout this seminar this afternoon, is that Fratelli Tutti is part of a program. It fits, it's the last of a triptych of his three encyclicals. He's written Laudato Si, Evangelii Gaudi. This is the third of the triptych. But not only that, what Pope Francis is doing here is building on the work of his predecessors. These are all very nicely brought together in this publication edited by Archbishop Kevin MacDonald. He might be watching this, I don't know, I hope he is. You're very welcome if you are. And there you'll see that he's collected the document that Professor Anna already referred to, Nostra Aetate, the groundbreaking document on interreligious dialogue from the Second Vatican Council, but also the Cinderella of modern encyclicals, Ecclesiam Suam, which nobody's heard of. We had its 50th anniversary recently, and we had a wonderful 3-day conference on it at St. Mary's. And Ecclesiam Suam was the first. I'm just going to skip over Nostra Aetate because we've already heard this from Professor Anna, so I don't need to say much more about Nostra Aetate. But Ecclesiam Suum was the first encyclical of Saint Paul VI. It's difficult to keep calling him Saint Paul VI, but I'm doing quite well with praying. I've always assumed he was a saint. I always assumed John the 23rd was a saint, and I always assumed Cardinal Newman was a saint. So I'm doing quite well in that three. The other one I've always assumed as a saint is Julian of Norwich, and I hear there's rumours that she's going to be made a saint. So I'll have got a full house. But anyway, Saint Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suum is an extraordinary document, and in a way he was the one, and that is the sort of model that I think Pope Francis adopts in Fratelli Tutti. He only refers to it once in Fratelli Tutti, but he refers to 3 times to other of Pope Paul's encyclicals. And the point, I'm not going to go into detail because we haven't got time, but the point Pope Paul makes in that encyclical is, he writes, "We are convinced the Church must look with penetrating eyes within itself, ponder the mystery of its own being, and draw enlightenment and inspiration from a deeper scrutiny of the doctrine of its own origin, nature, mission, and destiny." And what he's saying is that we achieve greater self-knowledge not only by engaging in our own reflection on Christianity, but engaging in dialogue with others. And by engaging in dialogue with other groups, we also discover more of the nature of the mystery of revelation. So engaging in dialogues with Jews, for example, will tell us more about the nature of the revelation that is Christianity. So in this encyclical, he sets down conditions or how dialogue will take shape. And again, this is, I think, assumed in Fratelli Tutti. And what I'll say in a moment about Fratelli Tutti, you can see that a lot of these conditions are taken into Fratelli Tutti. It's non-coercive, it's universal. Its aim is not conversion. That was a point that Professor Anna just raised when she was reading it. That is very important. It's to produce clarity in all participants. We have to conduct the dialogue in ordinary language, not in the highfalutin theological terms. Humility is central, with confidence in fellowship, and also we need to adapt it even to the conditions of the internet that we find ourselves in at the moment. So turning to Fratelli Tutti, and I've given a little quote here, "Others drink from other sources. For us, the wellspring of human dignity and fraternity is in the gospel of Jesus." And the source you see before you there, and again, Professor Anna might recognize this. This is from one of Ramon de Lul's books of dialogue. And what he does, he has, you can see on the right there, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. And they're debating, as they did in the Middle Ages, as to who was right. And what Lull does, he has a philosopher, it's the gentleman on the left, wearing rather nice robes, who will be the judge. And I think this is, again, an important element of Catholic understanding of dialogue. It takes place within, as it were, the flat playing field of reason. It has to take place within this accepted reason. So again, I'm not going to read all this out all in all. I'm just giving you the various quotes. But as you see in this section on chapter 6, which is entitled Dialogue and Friendship in Society, he starts out by stressing that dialogue is the center of what he's talking about. Approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, to find common ground. It's like Ramon Lull's playing ground. All these things are summed up in the one word, dialogue. If we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue. And again, a theme which I'm sure others will take up today, I'm not going to take them up, is he has one of his, he's quite good at side swipes, isn't he? He likes sort of swiping things. And he makes a point that we do not confuse this dialogue, which is a very positive thing, it's a very difficult thing in a way to achieve, with the feverish exchange of opinions on social media. on social networks, frequently based on media information that is not always reliable. So in our atomized social media world, he wants to make a distinction between the value of a dialogue that's deeper than that which goes on in the chat rooms of the internet. And for that to take place, it needs to be based on respect. And again, as I think Professor Anna's very nicely summarized, it's respecting the otherness of our dialogue partners. Authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. But on the other hand, and I think this is important, as it were, from a theological point of view, he doesn't want us to be all things to all people. The solution, he says, is not relativism. Under the guise of tolerance, relativism ultimately leaves the interpretation of moral values to those in power to be defined as they see fit. And then he gives a quote, a long quote from Laudato Si, again showing the interlinking between these dialogues. So we have, on the one hand, openness to the other, but we also, on the other hand, respect, as it were, the roots of our own point of view, the pool, the source from which we're drinking, which in our case is from the Christian pool. But also, as I say, that this takes place within the basis of rational argument. In a pluralistic society, dialogue is the best way to realize what ought always to be affirmed and respected apart from any ephemeral consensus. Such dialogue needs to be enriched and illumined by clear thinking, rational arguments, a variety of perspectives, and the contribution of different fields of knowledge and points of view. It's almost like a manifesto for the university, isn't it? I mean, this is taking place under the aegis of 2 universities, and this is the traditional point of the university, is to create this level playing field where this dialogue can take place within the structure of rational argument. And again, the fact that we're doing that this afternoon, I think, is testimony to the importance of this. If I could take it a little bit further, and as Professor Anna has done, I'm sure others will do today, we take from Fratelli Tutti what we want, in a way. I think that this requires for us today, and to answer the question of our panel, what are the implications of this for British society today? I think it requires what I call, and I've developed over the years, an ecumenical psychology. I mean, as a psychologist, I think about the psychology, if you like, of the ecumenical mindset. And I think this has 3 aspects to it. First of all, that we share the treasures and riches of each tradition. I mean, I don't need to enumerate the treasures of Judaism. They are truly wonderful, as are of Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism. We share those and the riches of them, and also the devotion that lies within them. We have a call to the return to the spiritual roots of our civilization. Again, what you hear throughout Fratelli Tutti is that the world we live in, and the pandemic in a way, has called us back to those spiritual roots. The world we live in has somehow come off its pedestal, come off its wheels. And the spiritual roots of our own civilization are based on silence, solitude, and poverty, true Franciscan ideals. And finally, as I've said all along, the acceptance of differences, and of course using knowledge to develop that. To end with, just 2 more comments. One is a quote from another hero of mine. I don't think he'll be made a saint anytime soon, but you never know. Abhishektananda is, to give him his Hindi Sanskrit name. He was a French priest, Henri Le Sceau, who went to India in the 20th century and engaged in dialogue with Hinduism. And I just want to quote this wonderful letter he wrote. This is towards the end of his life. He said, "Our time is one one of those without precedent in the history of the world, when the worldwide coming together makes us clearly see that we ourselves and our whole tradition and every tradition are essentially conditioned. And I think this is true. I mean, even in my short lifetime, the world has grown very small. And I think the introduction of the internet, I mean, it's only 20 years now, isn't it, since we've had the internet in daily use, but it's meant that we know far more about each other and the world we live in. He writes, we find ourselves once more Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, you could say also Jewish, for each one has his own line of development, marked out already from his mother's lap. But we also have to smile, not a smile which looks down condescendingly from above, still less a smile of mockery, but one which is simply an opening out, like the flower unfolding its petals. So in conclusion, in Fratelli Tutti, the Pope says that different religions, based on their respect for each human person as a creature called to be a child of God, contribute, as we've heard, significantly to building fraternity and defending justice in society. Dialogue between the followers of different religions does not take place simply for the sake of diplomacy, consideration, or tolerance. That's the point, again, that Pope Paul made at the beginning, that dialogue is not an added extra. You know, for many Christians or many Catholics today, you think, well, when you've finished doing everything else, you do a bit of dialogue. But on the contrary, Pope Paul and here Pope Francis are saying that dialogue is essential to our understanding, our identity as Christians. In the words of the bishops of India, the goal of dialogue is to establish friendship, peace, and harmony, and to share spiritual and moral values and experiences in a spirit of truth and love. And as the Pope said in an earlier address, there is a time for everything. And now is the time in which the Lord challenges us in a particular way to go out from ourselves and our own environs in order to bring his merciful love to a world thirsting for peace. Let us help one another to keep at the center the demands of the gospel and to spend ourselves concretely in this mission. And that's what I mean about the link between a mission and dialogue. Mission, dialogue, prayer, those are the three cornerstones of this. And to ask, he says, the grace of growing in prayer, in bearing witness, and in going out in mission. And as he says at the very end of the encyclical, and again, as Professor Anna mentioned just now, that this begins with the least in our society. And that's the famous picture of him there at the washing of the feet with the Muslim detainees in Rome. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Those are the websites and so forth if you want any more, but I shall return you to Ashley.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. That was great and a very good second session. Thank you very much. I put something on the chat room indicating how we hope to take questions and answers as quickly as we can towards the end. If you enter them via the chat room or the Q&A section. It's now a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Sara Silvestri. Sara is Senior Lecturer in International Politics at the City University, where she specializes in Islamism, in religion and politics and the European Union. She also heads up the university's PhD program. She's also a research assistant at Polis and St Edmund's College in Cambridge. And it's great to welcome you this afternoon, Sara. So it's over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I will show some slides just again for the pleasure of having some pictures as opposed to having words in it. Also in the spirit of what Francis has written in this beautiful encyclical letter. So I am a political scientist. I work on my most recent research, ongoing research, is actually on the contribution of the Catholic Church to the global governance of migration. So I've been following the increased attention of Francis in this topic. I had also followed what his predecessors had been doing. And I was really fascinated by this encyclical. I sort of fell in love. I sort of how and why, not from the academic side, not from because it's an encyclical that really, as the other speakers have said, tries to speak on a personal level, tries to put aside the academic debates, the scholarly debates, although there are references implicit in the quotations and in the images that he uses. But I found, I was really fell in love. Also, I tried to read the passages from the original version in Spanish, just the beauty of the language, how it flows, how it's really enchanting, and it's really like a friend speaking to you. The English version does not render, not even the Italian, does not render this closeness of the language. And so this is already taking away any potential barriers into this. The purpose of the whole attempt of writing Fratelli Tutti was to reinvigorate this sense of feeling part of a universal church, in fact, of a universal humanity that, even though is maybe sharing different religious beliefs, is sharing this common world. And this is building again also on what he wrote in Laudato Si. So the whole purpose of this encyclical is to enable dialogue to happen. And this previous specialists have already elaborated on this vision of dialogue that is implicit in here. So I wanted to share with you some of these sort of immediate feelings as opposed to scholarly reflections. Also because I was upset by some of the critics of Francis since his first encyclical, that were saying, oh, this is not a scholarly piece, it's not Benedict writing those beautiful theoretical elaborations on theology. But that's not the purpose of how Francis sees his mandate here. He acknowledges that there's other scholars that have done that scholarly part, and now it's time to get in touch with the left behind and with the disaffected from the church, and to revive the vitality of this message. So my task here was to reflect in this particular webinar, is to reflect on what he's been saying on the topic of migration. And on the topic of migration, he has not, so I'm trying to share now. Obviously, I can't share the screen perfect, doesn't matter. I'm not shy. Okay. So on the topic of migration, he has not been, whatever he writes in this encyclical is not new. It's not unexpected, because he made, the Lampedusa trip, the Lampedusa speech. He had elaborated already on how the church should be a field hospital. He had already made some very important contributions in relation to the UN Global Compact on Migration and the UN Global Compact on refugees. So what I find striking here is how he builds all those previous contributions into this coherent, but very, very simple, very humble, as the other speaker said, simple story of how at the end of the day, everything boils down to love, to fraternity, to friendship. And I was even struck by, as also some others said, he was careful to say, we are drinking at the well of Christianity, of the gospel, others may drink at another well. And I was struck by how he has actually not monopolized the notion of love. It doesn't say Christian love, it just says love. And that's the connector that enables to speak to others, whether they are believers in other religions or people that don't believe in any religion but can connect with the feeling of love. So this is really an immediate a sort of encyclical that I find speaks to the senses. Another very nice feature of this recurring feature of the encyclical is that it talks about the flavor of this fraternal love right at the start, and then it comes back, I can't remember at which point. So there is this sense that you experience love with your body, with your human contacts with the others, and also in your taste buds. It's part of this embodiment of the experience of being Christian. And in a way, it's another way also, I guess, to tell the story of the embodiment of Christ into, a human person, of the divine into a human person. But it's another way, maybe not a doctrinal way, to tell the story of what Christianity is about. So I found that all the choice of words and the choice of tone in itself is already breaking the barriers, the intellectual and the emotional barriers, and enable people to connect with it instinctively. As a political scientist, I'm not an economist myself, but like the other speakers, I also agree that maybe some of his comments on the economy are big brushes, and he's right in identifying the divisions of the world in the hierarchies of dependencies and of injustices caused by globalization. But yeah, there are also some other aspects that maybe have been ignored in the dimension of the economy. But let me go back to the dimension of migration. So as I said, he's not saying anything too new, but I found that in relation to the topic of migration, everything is sort of coming together better. So he's sort of scattered initiatives, like the idea of dismantling the Pontifical Council for Migration in 2016 and recreate an intra office new mandate for the promotion of human integral well-being. Sorry, I paraphrase now that the exact title is a complicated title. So it's about for the integral human development that does not distinguish the well-being of migrants from the well-being of the elderly, from the well-being of families, from the well-being of the citizens. So that action was not necessarily rationally presented or justified to the outside world. And now when you read this encyclical, when you see all those implicit references to the personalistic tradition of Catholicism and Christianity, when you see that attention to the person and to the duty and the courage of the church to help people become fully fledged individuals, no matter what kind of beliefs they may want to join. That's what this project is about. Also, the emphasis on the decision to bring forward the parable of the Samaritan, the stranger, the suspect person in the Jewish community to which Jesus belonged, has been identified as actually that person that has the courage to break the barriers and do the unthinkable, or do the obvious, but which wasn't taken for obvious by the good thinkers and by the high castes of society. So I found that all this explains those actions. And also when in December 2017, the Pope participated to these UN proceedings towards the preparation of the Global Compact for Migration and Refugees. In that particular circumstance, the Vatican, this new dicastery, produced an amazing list, unprecedented in my analysis as a political scientist, of practical suggestions that the Pope was bringing forward to the UN on how to adjust the system, on how to work with humanitarian corridors, how to improve the visa systems, how to, in practical terms, how to facilitate family reunification, how to care for illegal migrants, how to care for minors that were unaccompanied travelers again. So this was a list of not good intentions. That document of 2017 was not a list of good intentions of, oh, the Bible says we should be nice to each other, we should care for the stranger. No, it's actually a list. We have to do this. It's always in the present. Also, this encyclical is never in the future, is never in the conditional tense, is in the present. And it's also is never taking this paternalistic tone that other documents, previous, for instance, I was reading this morning, once again, Erga Migrantes Caritas, the Erga Migrantes document of 2005, which was laid down in sort of the infrastructure for the Catholic Church to deal with migrants. that document was definitely a document coming from a Western located church, a centralized church that was dictating top down what, you know, different bishops, what different parishes, what different entities, the Caritas groups should do. And that document is full of we should, we ought to. And that document was full of terminology that was differentiating the them and us, them, the migrants, oh, the poor migrants, the vulnerable migrants. And now in this document, there is never a sort of big differentiation. Yes, it refers to migrants and refugees, but it never, at least that's my reading in terms of linguistic analysis, it never really, you never feel a distance from the migrants and the refugees that are spoken into this document. And they're never different from the other people that need to be looked after by Christians and by, you know, this universal community of people of goodwill. You know, you have to care for the migrants in the same way in which you have to care for a shared response to COVID, in the same way in which you have to care for economic injustices or to have to care for the environment. And so I found all this really provocative and also explaining a lot, as I said, of the actions that had not been fully explained. I don't know how I'm doing with time. Yeah, and as a political scientist, I did not just read my section on migration, which is part of chapter 4, because migration comes up right from the start, from the early passages, and it's a constant theme. Also, Laudato Si has a lot of references to how, you know, this global attention to this responsibility of humans to care for the world involves also caring for the people that live in the world and, you know, are sharing this environment. So, but as a political scientist, I found also that this encyclical has this dual nature again, as it's very spiritual, it's very immediate, it's very working at the level of the instinct in a way, but also it's very political. It's very political, not so much, I agree with the others, as I said, with the elaboration on the analysis of the economic situation is not very sophisticated, whereas I found that the analysis of what needs to be done at the level of migration is much more sophisticated, especially when it comes down to giving, you know, guidelines. You have to give migrants and refugees better access to schools, to banks, to visa, to consular services, you know, these practical things. The other the part that I really liked as a political scientist, and I don't want here to go over the sort of remit of the other speaker, I will just mention this. I found that it was very courageous in denouncing populism, in denouncing xenophobia, in the same way as it was very forward thinking, or maybe a latecomer, but a forward thinker in the official documentations of the church to mention the Shoah. And so I found that it was courageous in telling Christians that to be wary of the ideologies that manipulate Christianity in order to isolate migrants, in order to other migrants and refugees. And I can see how this, you know, might be not go down well in some communities, but I found that this was perfectly in line with the reasoning of the rest of the reasoning of this document, because it was perfectly, totally 100% in line with that Erga Migrantes Caritas Christi document that I mentioned earlier of 2004, which was signed not by Ratzinger, but was signed by John Paul II, some sort of neutral, let's say, so to speak, neutral Pope, if we consider Ratzinger more being on the right wing side of the spectrum of Christian politics and Francis on the left side of Christian politics, we could broadly say that John Paul II was an in-between figure, a more acceptable figure from both. And that figure promoted that document 2004, which was also telling with different words, with another terminology, with different paternalistic tones, but was exactly saying the same things. We have to take responsibility for this shared world and for the people that live with it. And you cannot be a Christian unless you love the other. That was a message that was totally transparent in that document 2004, and is totally obvious and reiterated here over and over. So I found that it was courageous, but also in telling, in intervening, or some will feel as it is interfering with politics, But I also thought that it was the right call in a society, in a global society that is has lost trust in national domestic politics, but also in the politics of global institutions, in the global governance of migration and refugees issues on the part of the UN. It is very important that the Pope sort of redeems, in a way, the field of politics and re-encourage people of goodwill to inject morality and ethics into politics, to get involved in politics. So politics is not necessarily naturally corrupt. And from what is written here, I don't have the right passage at hand, but there is a very nice passage that basically argues that getting involved in politics is a responsibility and of the Christian. It's the obvious way to translate the gospel into something practical. So overall, I'm and also, sorry, another intervention that he makes, again, along the lines of condemning populism and condemning xenophobia and nationalism, also is connected with how he also presents the dangers of the internet, and it's reconnected to the way in which we tend to other migrants and refugees, and we tend to reject them because of their cultural backgrounds, because of their religious backgrounds, maybe they're Muslim and so on. So I like how he actually invites people to be courageous, because the gospel gives you the courage to take that step, to so go into the abyss. There is this nice path. We have these ancestral fears of the unknown, of the abyss. We are worried of who is not part of the village. We are worried about the barbarian. But if we have this spirit of fraternal care, of universal fraternal spirit, then we will be automatically drawn to the other, we'll be curious to discover the other, and it will be also in our interest, in our spiritual interest, as opposed to in our economic interest, to make the other comfortable in living their own life to their own fulfillment. So overall, I would say that this is the document showing a visionary Pope, not a scholarly Pope. Is a visionary Pope, political Pope. I am. It's not his choice of words, his choice of tone is not by chance. So this is not a platitude, a document that is deliberately a platitude of embracing the relativism of the political correctness discourse that is around in the world. I've heard critiques around those lines. I see this more as an attempt to see how from within the gospel, within this particular message of fraternal love and of human contact, immediate contact with the other, it is possible then to think in a different way and implement in a different way human rights and global governance and politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. I now welcome Dr. Maria Power, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Las Casas Institute and one of those who's organized this webinar. Her research interests focus on faith-based peace building in Northern Ireland, and she's just published a new book on social teaching and the theologies of peace in Northern Ireland. Maria, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. I'm just going to share my screen just for one slide to show a definition. Okay, right. And I'm afraid as well, I'm going to be talking about dialogue. So in recent years, it's become, I'm not going to talk about Northern Ireland because we're talking about Britain. And as you know, it's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So I think my relatives would be turning in their graves if I tried to talk about Northern Ireland as British, so I won't. So instead, I'm going to focus on some of the more disturbing aspects of British society that have become very apparent in the past couple of years. And I think in part, I know we've been kind of, Pope Francis is very disparaging about new forms of media, but I think in part, these new forms of media can be very empowering for activists, as long as they seek to engage in the cultures of encounter that Pope Francis wants us to start building, and which I'll be talking about today. So, as a peace studies scholar who spent years working on a very directly violent society, which has moved into a structurally violent society, trying to slideshow. Sorry. I would agree with Galtung that Britain is at present a structurally violent society. You could take the word violence out and put in justice, but at the end of the day, the issues are still the same, is that human flourishing and the common good are being denied to certain sections of our society because of the elements that they belong to. So, for example, their age, their class, or their ethnic background. And this is very problematic for Christians and for anyone, any person of goodwill, as Pope John the 23rd addressed all of his encyclicals to, and to whom they have been addressed since. But what I want to argue is that instead of seeing these as big macro issues, I think Francis, through this encyclical, which, like Sara, I found very spiritually uplifting, and as a Catholic found it incredibly nourishing, but also as a peace studies scholar, found it a very rich document that really has fed into my work. Pope Francis is actually a pope who provides the individual with hope. I know that he spends the first chapter telling us how terrible the world is, but he then goes on to tell us, well, actually, there are ways that you as an individual can do to fix it. But he also says that along with the rights that we have to not live in a structurally violent society, we also have responsibilities, and we ourselves have to work towards that. So he argues that one of the things that we have to do is, and I think I do feel that this comes from his experience of being a South American bishop, is that we have to build alternative possible futures for ourselves, and alternative possible futures for the societies we live in, be that the local community in which we reside, or or our nation, or indeed the global community. And he defines this as a society based on service to others rather than a desire to dominate, a society based on sharing with others other than the selfish scramble by each for as much as wealth as possible, a society in which the value of being together as human beings is ultimately more important than any lesser group, whether family, nation, race, or culture. Now, one of the things that's so frustrating with Catholic social teaching is that many people go to these encyclicals expecting a roadmap, but it's unfortunate that that's not what's given. I know Sara pointed out some kind of wonderful practical ideas that are highlighted in Fratelli Tutti, but unfortunately that's not often the case, and it's especially not the case when it comes to overcoming structurally violent behaviours like racism or classism. So the method and skills and tools that we need to develop are specific to the context in which we're living. And it is now contingent upon us as people of goodwill or Catholics, or however we want to define ourselves, to undertake a process of discernment in order to develop a society based upon the criteria set out in the Gospels, and in particular, harking back to Benedict here, the criteria that Christ sets out for us in the Sermon on the Mount. So one of the big things that struck me from this encyclical, but has also been a recurring theme of Francis's writings and of his actions as Pope, is the culture of encounter. And Francis argues that this culture of encounter enables people to live in a way that is pleasing to God. That's Fratelli Tutti number 74. And this culture of encounter, I think, is a way that we could use to overcome the structural violence that's, well, I think it's endemic in society at the moment. So Francis does very much frame this as the COVID-19 encyclical. And he argues that the pandemic has offered us a choice. We can reorganize the way we live together in order better to choose what matters. We can work together to achieve it. We can learn what takes us forward and what sets us back. We can choose. And that's from Let Us Dream, which is very much a companion volume to this encyclical. It is clear, therefore, that as people of goodwill, we need to come together to rethink the structures of British society, our involvement in creating those structures, and create a new vision which will allow what Francis calls a social peace to be established. And it's what Leonardo Boff has called an alternative possible future. We have to offer people alternative ways to live. Fratelli Tutti tells us that this will be based upon fraternity and social solidarity. The answers offered by the encyclical require patience and a willingness to do things differently, to create a paradigm in which the common good replaces ideological posturing. One of the most important things offered by Francis in Fratelli Tutti then is the hope that comes from having a method of creating a new society formed from a vision conceived by those who have experienced the degradation of conflict and poverty. So what I'm suggesting then is one of the things we need to do is actually dialogue with people who have experienced injustices such as racism, ageism, etc. For Britain, this means the formation of a new social covenant in which those who find themselves at the margins of society are given political, social, and economic agency. In other words, or to use Pope Francis's language, are given a voice. The most important teachings of this are therefore to be found in chapter 6, Dialogue and Friendship in Society, and in paragraphs 228 to 235 of chapter 7, Paths of the Renewed Encounter. These show us that we can create a new vision of society through a form of dialogue in which compromise is replaced with consensus, termed by Francis as a culture of encounter. And I think that just looking to Northern Ireland for a second, we can see that the Good Friday Agreement was very much based upon compromise, and it really hasn't worked there. And so that's a kind of a lesson to us all that consensus is needed when we're building a new future together. And I would suggest that this is something that we can do at both micro and macro levels. Such a culture of encounter, like non-violence, such as the non-violence that MLK practiced, is a way of life rather than a one-off action. It is a commitment to work both with the people that are marginalised rather than for them, and to allow them to be agents of their own destinies. Francis defines it thus: to speak of a culture encounter means that we as people should be passionate about meeting others, seeking points of contact, building bridges, planning a project that includes everyone. This becomes an aspiration and a style of life. The subject of this culture is the people, not simply one part of society that would pacify the rest with the help of professional and media resources. And again, Francis is having a sideswipe at new media and also the traditional media. The choice then is to live an art of encounter which directly challenges the accepted narratives of this is how society is, there is nothing we can do to change it. And this is how we make the first step in creating a new social covenant. We demonstrate our commitment to change. there are very kind of simple ways of doing this. For example, stepping out of our filter bubbles and echo chambers. And I know I myself am quite bad for unfollowing people that I don't like on social media, but also speaking to those with whom we would not normally engage, people who have different political views to us, for example, hearing their experiences, understanding why they feel the way they do or think the way they do, understanding their needs and opinions. At present, unfortunately, we live in a society that cannot accept difference easily, or which tolerates rather than respects difference. And I think the cancel culture that we've seen emerging over the past 18 months is very much indicative of this. Once such a decision to work towards the creation of a new social covenant has been made, the second step involves finding ways of reaching agreement that do not descend into polarization and which build a people that can accept differences. As one of my friends once said to me, it's knowing the difference between whether you're having a row with somebody or whether you're having a debate. Opposing ideas should be discussed in a spirit of honesty and openness, through which, quote, we grow in our ability to grasp the significance of what others say and do, even if we cannot accept it as our own conviction. In this way, it becomes possible to be frank and open about our beliefs, while continuing to discuss, to seek points of contact, and above all, to work and to struggle together. That's Fratelli Tutti, paragraph 203. However, such a process needs a commitment to social change and needs to move towards that, but also the development of a blueprint for a new social covenant, which respects human dignity and is committed to the creation of the common good. But the foundation of this new social covenant is consensus and truth. And I think this is where I would link back to those, to Peter and Anna. This can only be achieved through the contribution of a variety of perspectives, and that's something that's never hard to find anywhere. But despite this acceptance of difference, a conviction that it is possible to arrive at certain fundamental truths that will always be upheld. And Francis gives the example of human dignity. It is from this conviction that a blueprint for a new social covenant will grow, and a new way of treating people will grow, or a new way of forming your local community will grow. The resulting covenant will contain a set of social ethics upon which public policy or local community policy can be based. In Fratelli Tutti, Francis teaches that the art of encounter should be rooted in three elements that combine subsidiarity, solidarity, and human dignity. It is only when these three elements combine that the art of encounter can truly create social peace. So to conclude then, when I read Fratelli Tutti, I realized that it was the encyclical about peace that we had all been waiting for. But it was not the encyclical transforming Catholicism into a faith which solely teaches non-violence as the way to peace that was hoped for by some. It was more about creating a just peace, and I'm happy to talk about that in the questions. Rather, it provides something much deeper, which acknowledges the messiness of the 21st century and the truth that, despite globalization, Catholic social teaching needs to be contextualized locally, nationally, and globally, taking into account the experience of those living on the margins. Francis wants us to move beyond protest. In Fratelli Tutti, he is asking us to do the hard work that comes after the protest has ended and the placards have been thrown away. I mean, how many of us were on the march against violence against women a couple of years ago, and yet I feel nothing has moved on. This is the transformation into a positive peace, which occurs when a society has taken the time to examine its faults and correct them. Through such a process, a social covenant based upon this common good becomes the cornerstone of that society's decision-making. COVID-19 has helped people to realise that society needs to be remade. In terms of Britain, Francis's teachings indicate that that change can be achieved through dialogue. Communities now need to enact the principles of subsidiarity and solidarity and voice their visions for policymaking. These visions, based upon lived experience, can be born from the creative tensions that disagreement brings. And unless they are expressed, absolutely nothing can change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was great. And our final panelist is the Right Honourable Ruth Kelly, who was until recently Pro-Vice Chancellor of St Mary's University. She was Secretary of State for Education and Secretary of State for Transport in the Labour governments led by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And recently, she was appointed as one of the first women to the Vatican Council for the Economy. Ruth, it's very great to have you this afternoon. It's over to you now.
Thank you very, very much, Ashley. I'm slightly aware of time here, so I'll try to keep my comments fairly concise. I've decided to use the technique of PowerPoint, which I hope will be successful. But if it isn't, we shall have to reassess. But I am going to screen share. Okay, so I hope everyone can see the screen. Please signal if you can't. Yes, great. Well, I opened the newspaper yesterday morning and I saw this face. Let's hope I can move on. Staring back out at me, and I thought for a moment, my goodness, my work's been done. Here's a Catholic politician who's talking about civility in politics and how to foster a culture of respect. I read on and was slightly disappointed to be reminded that Parliament is still full of people who bully their staff, who are accused of sexual harassment, and where civility is far from the norm. So that's in fact what Jacob Rees-Mogg was talking about in the newspaper. And it just reminded me that there was a long way to go to try to live the ideals that have been set out in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti. But what I was pleased to say, as Sara has said earlier, is that right at the heart of Fratelli Tutti is the desire to resurrect, as it were, politics as a noble profession. And that certainly needs to be done. People who've been in politics can never forget what it was like to live through the sleaze accusations, the expenses scandal, and then the divisiveness that came in the adversarial Brexit referendum, when experts were dismissed out of hand and people voted very much on their core instincts. So there's a real need for politics to be rehabilitated. So I welcome the encyclical in that spirit. Pope Francis, very clear in the encyclical, I appeal for a renewed appreciation of politics as a lofty vocation and one of the highest forms of charity, in as much as one seeks the common good. And it's an act of charity to assist someone suffering, but it's also an act of charity, even if we do not know that person, to work to change the social conditions that caused his or her suffering. Very heartening for someone who spent much of their life in politics. The major themes for me about politics and in the encyclical were the following: that we need an inclusive economics, and we've heard a little bit about that already today. I'll come back to these in a moment. We need an inclusive politics. We need to try and nation and community build, and we need to try and set long-term societal goals which appeal across party boundaries to the good of the people. Now, I'll come and say a little bit later how hard I think that task is in practice. But to start with inclusive economics, and as we've heard already, this is a well-worn theme in recent papal pronouncements. The Pope has got a very particular take on neoliberal, what he calls neoliberal individualist or liberal economics. What he has in mind very clearly comes across as open economies which are captured by the strongest economic powers, who use those freedoms and powers available within free markets in certain contexts to exploit others rather than to open up opportunities to them. Now, as I read it, and others may disagree, he's not against the free market per se. In fact, in many respects, he's very pro-free market as a way of individual and civic expression, but he is very much against unregulated markets. And he recognises that free markets need to be underpinned by common law and by inclusive institutions. So quite a nuanced reading there of his views, I think, are essential to understanding his sort of distrust of markets in the terms that he writes it. He calls for a proactive pro-employment economic policy, And interestingly, no mention of communism, as there hasn't been much mention of communism in recent papal encyclicals, which must now be considered an ideological foe that has long since been slain. So what is an inclusive economy characterised by? Well, first of all, the Pope says that work is the finest help we can give the poor. So lots of lessons for us to learn there as politicians and indeed as society. And there's a real emphasis on work, but also on education and skills, which are essential, he writes, to enabling people to improve their situation and find pathways out of poverty. Interestingly, he seems to reject out of hand welfare policies which hold people in dependency, rather than help them on up the ladder, as it were, into the world of work. Helping the poor financially must always be a provisional solution in the face of pressing needs. The broader objective, he says, should always be to allow them a dignified life through work. And again, welfare projects which meet certain urgent needs should be considered merely temporary responses. And of course, in the UK, you can think of things like food banks and so forth to support the poor through times of particular difficulty. Now, I find it really interesting to see his views set out in this encyclical, because I find that they sit quite uneasily with the call in Let Us Dream, which, as has been said, is more or less a parallel document published recently, for us to consider a universal basic income. A universal basic income would be a unmeans-tested benefit given to everyone as of right, every individual, perhaps over the age of 18, as of right, not conditional on seeking work. So there's an interesting theme, I think, for us to explore. And he's very clear that markets need to be underpinned by common bonds of trust, which the Pope says are repudiated in neoliberal economics. So he's clearly got a very extreme version of an unregulated free market in mind when he attacks it. Economics, he says, is an integral part of a political, social, cultural and popular programme directed towards the common good. And this is interesting too. He doesn't see economics as a standalone science. He sees it very much as part of a programme in which society moves towards the common good together. Then there's his emphasis on inclusive politics. And this is where not just as neoliberal economics, as it were, get dismissed as an answer to our problems, but so does demagoguery and populism. So this is a hugely important theme in the Pope's writing in recent years. Populism, he says, can often exploit the vulnerable for its own ends, or indeed exploit a whole people's culture for their own personal advantage or continuing grip on power. And there's a very interesting discussion of what it means to be a people. So in the context of what it means to be a populist, what does it mean to be a popular leader, and what does it mean to be a people? And the Pope calls that a people a mythic category, an open-ended idea which is living and dynamic, and therefore welcome, as we've heard, to the other, to the stranger, to the migrant, to the future, as well as recognising the past with humility. To be a part of a people, he says, is to be a part of a shared identity arising from social and cultural bonds. And that is not something automatic, but rather a slow, difficult process of advancing towards a common project. And I think this emphasis on nurturing social and cultural bonds as a way to help a people make progress is again a very particular perspective that is brought from Pope Francis in his writing. We've heard a lot about the need for dialogue, so I won't emphasise that, apart from to say that as part of his inclusive politics, he sees not just people of different faiths, but very much people who are on the margins of society, perhaps in communities, perhaps in different racial groups and so forth, but people who are being held back, being enabled to have their voices heard in the political system. So what's the inclusive politics characterised by? Well, certainly dialogue, every voice heard at the table, and there's a real emphasis on building local civil society. Good politics will seek, he says, ways of building communities at every level of social life in order to recalibrate and reorientate globalization and thus avoid its disruptive effects. So communities on the fringes and groups on the fringes of political life that are often ignored by mainstream politicians are sort of brought right in by Pope Francis to the centre to re-energise the political debate. And these social movements, he says, are social poets and sowers of change. Again, a very particular take of Pope Francis on how politics should respond to popular demands. I said I found it slightly more controversial, his emphasis on long-term goals, which may seem a very strange statement to make, because you would want all politicians to concentrate on long-term goals. Go into that in a moment, because Pope Francis says that politicians need to forge a common project for the human family. Obviously, they need to repudiate short-term concerns with opinion polls, although I must say that's easier said than done, and calls for a politics that is far-sighted and capable of a new integral and interdisciplinary approach to handling different aspects of the crisis. True statescraft is manifest when in difficult times we uphold high principles and think of the long-term common good. Political powers do not find it easy to assume this duty in the work of nation building, much less in forging a common project for the human family. Well, that's an understatement in my view. Pope Francis says political charity is expressed in a spirit of openness to everyone. Government leaders should be the first to make the sacrifices that foster encounter and to seek convergence on at least some issues. They should be ready to listen to other points of view and to make room for everyone. Now, to go back to the newspapers, I picked up yesterday's Times, as you saw at the beginning, and here's another article that was also in yesterday's Times by Hugo Rifkind. And this isn't supposed to be a political point, by the way. It just happens that Labour is in opposition at the moment, so I'm using Keir Starmer as an example of an opposition leader and the sorts of criticism that the opposition comes under. What is the point of an opposition that doesn't want to bring down the government? Starts the article. It continues. Fundamentally, Starmer lacks the ability to project the idea that what Britain really needs is for the government to fall messily apart right now. Brexit chaos, lockdown and vaccine rollout notwithstanding, and to be replaced by him instead. A zealot or a blowhard could manage it. In the same situation, Jeremy Corbyn or Nigel Farage or even Boris Johnson himself certainly would try. Starmer instead just wrings his hands, transparently aware that things could be much, much worse, but without the cavalier swagger to pretend that he personally could make them much, much better. The honesty of this approach may be refreshing, but honestly, what's the point of it? And of course, that is the classic political conundrum, is that people want you to oppose for opposition's sake. But I was heartened then by turning to a practicing politician. Again, it just happens that Jess Phillips is Labour. Again, about Keir Starmer, taking the opposite point of view, and as a practicing politician, quite interesting. I'll just take the last line. Yes, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have supported the government in some of the things they have done. We do this because we are grown-ups. And I thought to myself, well, that's the sort of thing that Pope Francis is talking about. But to go back, cross-party consensus is an incredibly difficult thing to create. It's often represented as a failure. On some life and death issues, COVID, going to war, the bailout of the banks and the financial crisis, and I would add the Northern Ireland debate might be another issue like this. It might be possible to get people with naturally opposing views to come together to find a way forward. But key issues about the economy and society are highly partisan. And even if politicians share the same goal of an inclusive economy based on regulated free markets and inclusive politics, it is very difficult even to establish the goals, never mind to think about how to implement them. Take the debate over austerity, over Brexit, or even over something much smaller like private education. It is incredibly difficult to think that you will establish not just the goal, but also the ways of implementing them. And Westminster politics is set up like that. It actually works reasonably well at exposing debates, scrutinising issues, and putting them forward to people at manifestos in elections. Occasionally there are really hard issues that neither side wants to tackle, and the issues do get moved into royal commissions, for instance, on long-term care, but still the recommendations haven't been taken up by any political party. Experts are commissioned when there's an issue like funding the NHS, and occasionally people rely on opposition support to get an issue through the Commons. But these situations are extremely rare, although it's worth remembering partisan debates in the Lords, less partisan debates in the Lords, and the valuable work done in committees and all-party parliamentary groups. What we can do is take the encyclical, I think, at lower levels of society. We can try to build cultural and social bonds, work towards a society in which work is promoted for all who can work and want to do so, create opportunities for marginal voices to be heard, and work on people, actually, raise people's aspirations for society. Try to point out the way forward and the way towards the common good rather than appealing to their baser instincts. All of this, however, I would say, is extremely difficult and a real challenge for practicing politicians. So I will end at that point.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed on that note. As it happens, we have not had any questions or comments in the chat room, which is astonishing. But in order to give ourselves a proper hour before the sessions resume for the second part of the symposium, I will bring things to a close now. I'm very grateful to the panelists for all they've given. There's been so much here really for us to think about. If you come back at 6 for the second part of the symposium, we'll have a chance to raise questions in the chat room relating to these first sessions if you wish. And we hope to find ways of you to be able to raise questions as well. So thank you all very much indeed. And I hope to see you all again at 6 o'clock when I'm not chairing, although I'm one of the panelists. See you then. And I'll hand over to whoever's handling the technology.